This week, a magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck off the Oregon coast, and if you saw the headline, your first thought was probably the same as everyone else's. Is this it? Is this the Cascadia earthquake scientists have been warning us about for decades? The one capable of leveling coastal towns from Northern California to British Columbia and sending a 100-foot tsunami barreling toward shore? I need to answer that question directly and honestly right away, because the answer actually teaches you something genuinely important about how this entire fault system works, and it's more interesting than a simple yes or no. No, this specific earthquake was not the Cascadia megathrust rupturing, but understanding exactly why it wasn't, and exactly what it actually was instead, is the single best way to understand the real fault sitting quietly offshore, still locked, still loading with stress, still capable of producing the most consequential natural disaster the Pacific Northwest has ever faced. So today, we're going to walk through what actually moved this week, why it's genuinely different from the fault everyone's actually worried about, what scientists have learned recently about just how bad a real Cascadia rupture could be, and what the honest current state of the science says about when this might actually happen. Let's start with what actually occurred. The magnitude 6.0 earthquake struck roughly 190 miles west of Coos Bay, Oregon, offshore, in open ocean, with no tsunami threat issued and no damage reported on shore. More than 120 people across the region submitted reports saying they'd felt it, which for an earthquake that far offshore is itself a notable amount of shaking to register on land. A follow-up magnitude 3.1 event struck in the same general area a few hours later. This wasn't an isolated fluke either. Earlier this year, another swarm of earthquakes lit up overnight in a similar offshore stretch, active enough that a University of Washington seismologists described it as super active since midnight, with the largest event in that particular sequence reaching magnitude 4.2. Here's the detail that actually matters most in both of these cases. Neither of them occurred on the Cascadia Subduction Zone itself. They occurred on a completely different structure called the Blanco Fracture Zone, an active fault system running roughly 200 miles long, northwest, off the coast of Washington and Oregon, situated along the Juan de Fuca Plate. The Blanco Fracture Zone is genuinely one of the most seismically active faults in the entire region, capable of producing hundreds of earthquakes every single year. The overwhelming majority of them small, sub-magnitude 3 events that only ever get picked up by seismometers rather than felt by anyone. It's also mechanically distinct from the megathrust fault itself. Scientists studying the April swarm made this distinction explicit and public specifically to head off exactly the kind of panic a headline like Pacific Northwest earthquake tends to generate. As one geologist put it directly, the earthquakes were happening at the Juan de Fuca Ridge, not anywhere near the Cascadia Subduction Zone, explaining that this is actually a spreading boundary, a place where the Juan de Fuca Plate is pulling apart from the neighboring Pacific Plate and generating entirely new oceanic crust in the process. A completely different tectonic process from the compressional plate colliding subduction happening closer to shore. A different expert monitoring a separate offshore swarm was similarly direct. We do not need to be concerned about this swarm of earthquakes offshore, noting these events are far from land and pose no risk at all to people living in the region. So if that's not the fault we should actually be worried about, let's talk about the one that is. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is a roughly 700-mile-long fault system, sitting between about 70 and 100 miles off the Pacific coast, stretching from northern Vancouver Island in British Columbia all the way down to northern California. It marks the boundary where the Juan de Fuca Plate is being forced underneath the much larger North American plate, descending gradually into the Earth's mantle as the two plates converge at a rate of roughly 4 centimeters a year, an almost imperceptibly slow creep that, over centuries, has built up an enormous, still unreleased amount of stored tectonic stress. Unlike the frequent near-daily seismicity happening along the Blanco Fracture Zone, the actual megathrust interface, the zone where the two plates are, directly locked against each other by friction, has been almost entirely eerily silent. Throughout the entire period, scientists have had modern instruments capable of monitoring it. That silence isn't a sign of safety. It's a sign that this particular stretch of fault is fully locked, accumulating strain with essentially nothing currently escaping to relieve it. We know precisely how this fault behaves when it finally does let go, because it last ruptured on January 26, 1700, and we know that exact date thanks to a remarkable piece of scientific detective work. Japanese historical records describe an orphan tsunami that struck the Japanese coastline that year with no local earthquake to explain it. A tsunami that had silently crossed the entire Pacific Ocean from a quake nobody in Japan had felt happen. Combine that with Native American oral traditions describing violent shaking and coastal flooding, and with physical geologic evidence, buried marsh layers, sudden land subsidence, and offshore sediment deposits, and scientists have been able to reconstruct not just that single, precisely dated 1700 event, but a much longer history behind it. Paleoseismic researchers studying that geologic record have identified evidence of 43 separate earthquakes along this fault system over roughly the past 10,000 years, giving scientists a genuine long-term statistical basis for estimating how often this fault tends to rupture, and just how overdue the current 326-year-long quiet stretch actually is relative to that historical average. Here's where the science gets specific about what a future rupture could actually look like, because Cascadia doesn't have to break in one single uniform way. If only the southern portion of the fault gives way, researchers estimate the resulting earthquake would land somewhere between magnitude 8.0 and 8.6, an event scientists currently put at roughly a 37 to 43% chance of occurring sometime within the next 50 years. If the entire 700-mile zone ruptures at once, a full margin event, the magnitude would climb into the 8.7 to 9.2 range, a scenario researchers currently estimate at somewhere between a 15 and 22% chance within that same 50-year window, depending on exactly which research team's modeling you're looking at. FEMA's own analysis of that full margin magnitude 9.0 scenario estimates it would kill approximately 14,000 people across Oregon and Washington combined. A separate, more localized assessment for a single Oregon county alone projected fatalities, specifically within that county, ranging from 650 to 5,000, more than 27,000 residents displaced from their homes, roughly 24,000 buildings completely destroyed, and another 85,000 structures sustaining damage severe enough to require months or years of repair. The infrastructure recovery timeline associated with this kind of event is genuinely sobering once you see the actual numbers laid out. According to Oregon's own regional emergency planning assessments, water and sewer systems in the hardest hit areas could remain offline for anywhere from 1 month to a full year. Electricity could take 1 to 3 months to restore. Police and fire stations could be non-operational for 2 to 4 months. The most critical highway corridors, the road's emergency responders and supplies, would need to actually reach affected communities, could remain impassable for 6 to 12 months. And healthcare facilities, hospitals and clinics people would desperately need in the earthquake's immediate aftermath could be offline for as long as 18 months. Oregon's State Department of Emergency Management has been candid that, given the state's current preparedness levels, residents should realistically expect to be without meaningful outside services and assistance for at least 2 weeks following the earthquake itself, and likely considerably longer in the hardest hit coastal communities. Recent research has added a genuinely new and genuinely unsettling layer to this picture, one that goes beyond the shaking and the tsunami most people already associate with this fault. When Cascadia last ruptured in 1700, the sudden release of a centuries of built-up stress didn't just shake the ground violently for what researchers estimate could be as long as 5 minutes straight, and didn't just generate tsunami waves that new research suggests could reach as high as 100 feet in the most exposed locations. It also caused the land itself to instantly drop in elevation. Geologist Tina Dura, an assistant professor at Virginia Tech who studies this exact phenomenon, has found fossil evidence showing that previous Cascadia earthquakes immediately converted what had been dry coastal ground into tidal mudflats, essentially permanently flooding land that had been above the waterline just moments before. That's going to happen again, Dura said plainly, and we've built up a lot of those areas. She specifically pointed out that this is exactly the kind of low-lying coastal ground where many of the region's ports are actually located today, meaning a future rupture wouldn't just damage buildings and trigger a tsunami. It could permanently, irreversibly submerge sections of the coastline that currently host some of the region's most critical maritime infrastructure. This matters even more when you consider a genuinely strange detail about this specific stretch of coastline. While regions like the Chesapeake Bay and Virginia are gradually sinking through a slow, well-understood process called subsidence, parts of the Pacific Northwest coast have actually been rising in recent decades, a product of the same locked tectonic plates, slowly bending and deforming as stress builds. That means a sudden Cascadia rupture wouldn't just flood already sinking land the way it might elsewhere. It would abruptly reverse years of gradual uplift in a matter of minutes, dropping communities down to a lower elevation almost instantaneously, and leaving many of them permanently below the waterline once the tsunami itself has receded. There's also newer research specifically examining the fault's physical structure that deserves mention here, distinct from anything happening on the Blanco fracture zone. Scientists have recently discovered evidence of an actual tear developing in the Juan de Fuca Plate off the coast of Vancouver Island, a section of the subducting slab that appears to be pulling apart from the rest of the plate. For the first time, researchers have clearly documented that finding briefly generated some hope that this specific segment of the fault might be gradually losing its capacity to produce a major rupture. Researchers studying it have been careful to note that conclusion moves well ahead of the actual evidence. The tear is real, and it is localized specifically to that one segment near Vancouver Island, but it doesn't tell you anything definitive about how the central or southern portions of this 700-mile fault, running through Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, will ultimately behave. As part of the same ongoing research effort, scientists are actively working to expand offshore monitoring instrumentation along the fault, including new early warning sensor networks specifically designed to give coastal communities as much advance notice as physically possible once an actual megathrust rupture does begin. So how do you actually hold this entire picture together? Here's the honest, complete version. What moved this week, and what's moved repeatedly throughout this year in similar offshore swarms, is real seismic activity, genuinely worth acknowledging and understanding, but it's occurring on separate structures, the Blanco Fracture Zone and the Juan de Fuca Ridge, that are mechanically distinct from the actual subduction, megathrust, and pose no direct risk of triggering it. The fault that actually could reshape the entire Pacific Northwest coastline remains exactly where it's been for the past 326 years, locked, silent, and steadily accumulating the stress that new research increasingly suggests will produce even more severe, longer-lasting consequences than earlier hazard assessments accounted for, from permanent coastal flooding to infrastructure outages measured in months rather than days. If you live anywhere along this stretch of coastline, from Northern California through Oregon and Washington into southern British Columbia, here's what actually matters. First, don't let an offshore magnitude 6.0 on the Blanco Fracture Zone convince you that the big one has started. But also don't let the explanation that it's a separate, harmless fault convince you the underlying Cascadia risk is any less real or any less worth preparing for. Both things are true at once, and understanding the difference is exactly the kind of media literacy this channel keeps coming back to. Second, know specifically whether you live in one of the low-lying coastal zones Tina Dura's research has flagged as vulnerable to sudden, permanent submersion, not just temporary tsunami flooding, since that's a meaningfully different planning consideration than a standard flood zone designation might suggest. Third, take Oregon's own 2-week self-sufficiency. Guidance seriously, and frankly, consider extending it, given how clearly the state's own infrastructure recovery timelines point toward a multi-month, not multi-day, road back to normal essential services in the hardest hit areas. Fourth, know your evacuation route to higher ground if you're anywhere in a tsunami inundation zone, and know it well enough to move on instinct, since models suggest some coastal areas could see tsunami waves arrive in as little as 15 to 20 minutes after the shaking starts. And fifth, download your region's earthquake early warning app, whether that's Shake Alert-based coverage in the US or Canada's equivalent system further north, since even a handful of seconds of advanced notice can meaningfully change how prepared you are the moment real shaking actually begins. So here's where this stands as of today. A magnitude 6.0 earthquake did strike off the Oregon coast this week, and it's a legitimate, real seismic event worth understanding, but it occurred on the Blanco Fracture Zone, not on the Cascadia Subduction Zone megathrust that actually poses the region's most severe long-term hazard. That megathrust remains locked and silent, as it has been for 326 years, continuing to accumulate the stress behind what scientists currently estimate as a 15 to 22% chance of a full margin magnitude 8.7 to 9.2 rupture within the next 50 years, an event capable of killing thousands, permanently submerging low-lying coastal communities, and knocking out essential infrastructure for months at a time across the entire region. Recent research into the fault's physical structure, the newly discovered tear near Vancouver Island, and the genuinely alarming findings about permanent post-earthquake flooding has only added new layers of complexity and concern to a hazard scientists were already treating with the utmost seriousness. I'll keep tracking both the routine, non-threatening offshore activity along the Blanco Fracture Zone and any genuinely new research or monitoring developments concerning the actual megathrust itself. If breakdowns like this help you tell the difference between an earthquake that made headlines and an earthquake that actually matters for your own safety, subscribe, because that distinction is exactly what I'm trying to give you every time a story like this comes across the wire. I'll see you in the next one.